to you perfectly. Okay, Trustee Lewis, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the legislation that's been proposed in Albany talks about a rate freeze. And the reporting on it, as I've seen it, always refers to it just as a rate freeze. It doesn't qualify that rate freeze. But my understanding and common sense would tell me that it's not really a freeze of the entire rates, that it's probably not covering the fuel charge. And I wondered, as our Chief Financial Officer, and I'm assuming that you've taken something of a look at the legislation, am I correct in understanding that the law would not cover, the rate freeze would not cover fuel charges?
That's correct. The rate freeze would cover all aspects of our tariff except for the power supply charge.
So for the average homeowner, are you able to say like what percentage of the bill is power supply charges versus what percentage is the delivery rate?
So as you well know, the power supply charge fluctuates monthly based on market conditions. Right now, the power supply charge is roughly 40 to 50% of a customer's bill, and the remaining is the delivery charge.
So in the time that I've been on the board, there hasn't been big rate increases of the delivery charge. I know we voted for, I think it was 1.9% a year before last or so. Could you say in the last 15 years how much has the delivery charge, the portion of the bill that this law would freeze, how much of that has been raised in the last 15 years?
In the last 15 years, there have been 2 delivery charges. There was an increase in March of 11 of about 1.8%, and then in March of 12, as you just mentioned, a 1.9% increase.
So 15 years, those 2, you add them together, that's about 3.7%. So if I do my math right, that's 1/4% of an increase in the delivery charge over 15 years is what we're talking about freezing going forward.
That's correct.
The I read on a newspaper website just the other day something I've often heard repeated, which is that in the 15 years since LIPA took over Loco's operations, that the $7 billion Shoreham debt, not a penny of it's been paid off. Is that true? Do we still have $7 billion of Shoreham debt on the books?
So that's a complicated answer. So let me see if I should try it this way. So we still have $7 billion of debt on the balance sheet. So that's a fact. However, over the course of the last 15 years, we have paid down a certain amount of debt, but then had to go out and raise new debt to finance capital additions that we've made to the system during that 15-year period. Coincidentally, those 2 numbers basically wash one another out. Right. So we have obviously retired a lot of debt during that last 15-year period. We just had to raise debt to finance the system expansion during that time.
Right, as all utilities do, and as we've pointed out many times before, and as we've had discussions about debt reduction and things like that, we've sort of made that clear, but I guess according to that website, it doesn't come across.
That's correct.
So could I ask another question? In the 1.5-year process that we went through with the Brattle Group, where we evaluated different options, one of the numbers that stuck in my head was that it was told to us that if you privatized LIPA, what you would have to do with the debt in terms of changing hands and selling it off and trying to retire parts of it and whatnot, that there was a defeasance cost. And as I said, the number stuck in my head because it was something like $900 million or almost $1 billion that it would cost in defeasance costs. So now we have a proposal that is to privatize the operations while still keeping some kind of a holding company of LIPA intact. Does this proposal, you know, when you read through the 70 pages, most of it is all about the securitization plan, which, as I understand it, that could be done without having to do any of the other things. The chairman said, you know, if it's a good idea to reduce the debt, you know, in his opening comments, I certainly agree with his point. If securitization makes sense, then let's do it. But the public should know what the cost would be. And So is there a defeasance cost, and is it the same number? If it was $1 billion to defease the entire debt, are we talking about the entire debt? If it's half of that, are we talking about a $500 million cost to the ratepayers for this securitization plan?
So I honestly can't give you a number and an answer to that question because it really depends on which bonds are defeased or included in the securitization. It depends on how much we ultimately securitize. So it really is subject to whatever we actually do in the financing deal. There will be a defeasance cost, absolutely. How much that is will ultimately be determined upon which bonds we do retire and put into the securitization. So I'm not trying to avoid your question, but it's.
Right, but the objective would
Mike,
be to
could I just-
defease
could I
those
ask
bonds. Yeah,
the-
just
the
want, yes.
Question
Trustee
another way.
Olinsky.
When Brattle did their report, there were two factors that have changed from then until today, which dramatically impact the defeasance costs. Number one was the interest rate assumption. Interest rates, when Brattle did their report, were 200 basis points higher than they are today, roughly. So that would impact defeasance. And also, it was a duration cost as to how far away you are from the call dates of those bonds. We are now 4 years closer
Correct.
to call dates, and some bonds that were at that moment in time still non-callable have become callable. So there would not be necessarily defeasance costs associated with them. So I think if you just assumed the change in duration and the change in interest rate, the defeasance cost that Brattle had said was $1 billion would probably, at that time, 900 or $1 billion, would probably be about 400 million today if you defeased every non-callable bond. When you now go and look at the securitization structure, there will have to be an analysis made as to the financial viability of defeasing a bond and the cost associated with that bond if it is still non-callable. It's the amount of how much you have to put in the escrow, the amount of negative arbitrage, and I don't think that we would do a securitization that would be non-economic or take a bond and securitize it under this new structure that would be non-economic to the organization and to our ratepayers. So the reality may be that the securitized deal may be $1.5 billion or $2 billion of our debt, depending on what the positive economics are of the market and the duration of bonds still yet to be called.
So we don't know right now whether we're actually talking about the entire debt being securitized, because again, that's how it's being reported, that all of LIPA's $7 billion debt is going to be put into this securitization plan. But what you just said, it's probably something much less than that.
Well,
Right, I know.
again, it can ultimately, at some point in time, be all of the debt, because if interest rates and market conditions stay where they are and you do another transaction a year or two later, that means that bonds that were out of the realm of being economic may fall into the realm of being economic. I think right now, to meet the economics of it being positive for the authority and our ratepayers, you have to look at, what it can be done on a tax-exempt basis, what can be done on a taxable basis. And you could be looking at as much as, $2 billion right now to be able to refund. If we got the approval and the legislation and the SPE was set up, that could be done today based on market conditions. At the time you do the transaction 3 months from now, if interest rates drop another 20 basis points, that number could grow to $3 billion. It's hard, as Mike said, to give an exact amount, but I would say that based on looking at our bonds, that $7 billion today would not be economic to do.
Right, and that was the point I was going to ask Mike to make, that there are only a certain amount that could be.
Correct.
But this may not be if we get the securitization one time and one time only. So we'd obviously want to do it was economic and made sense and made sure that the net present value savings to the ratepayers were worth doing the transaction.
And the point being that the securitization should be viewed like a refunding. And if there is economic value to refunding bonds either through the securitized structure or through an advanced refunding structure, we should be looking at doing that because it reduces the debt service costs to our ratepayers. So it should be viewed the same way as another opportunity to restructure our debt and reduce our annual debt service costs.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a different question. That's fine.
Just one second. I see trustee Greenfield has a question. I want to
I
give
want
him
to
an
ask our
opportunity.
CFO for a progress update on our FEMA claim.